My focus in this talk is not on any particular digital identity system per se. Instead, what I'm going to be focusing on is the trustworthy status of digital identity systems. In particular, I'm going to be focusing on this question of what it means, or what it might mean, for a digital identity system to qualify as trustworthy. And in answering this question, I'll be taking a look at some of the problems confronting the effort to develop a theoretical account of trustworthiness. And I'll also be proposing a new account of trustworthiness in an effort to deal with these problems. So I'll start by taking a very, very quick look at some of the existing literature, some of the existing theoretical accounts that have been developed over the last 20 or 30 years. I'm not going to go through these accounts, but suffice to say, we can see that there are a number of problems straight off the bat. So the first one is probably self-evident. There are at least 5 different accounts on offer, and it's difficult to know which one is the correct one, if any of them are. So this is a problem that I will call the unification problem. There is a second problem here in that all of these accounts, and in general accounts of trustworthiness in the literature, especially the philosophical literature, tend to be directed towards the sort of trust that emerges in human-to-human relationships. So the notion of trustworthiness tends to be applied to human individuals rather than, say, a technological system or a socio-technical system. And this sort of problem is what I will call the truster problem. In addition to these 2 problems, we have a further problem, which I will call the relativity problem. So the main issue here is that the term trustworthy digital identity system is suggestive of a particular conception of trustworthiness. In short, it suggests that a system, or indeed any trustee, can be evaluated as being either trustworthy or untrustworthy, which is to say that trustworthiness is a property of the system or the trustee, as opposed to being something akin to a relational property, where the notion of trustworthiness is relative to particular trusters rather than being independent of those trusters. And of course, when it comes to national identity systems, there is surely a sense in which we want a system to be trustworthy, or we want trustworthiness to be a property of the system. We want to have a kind of absolute or simpliciter sense of trustworthiness, as opposed to a more relativistic sense of trustworthiness, in which trustworthiness is relative to particular people, such that a system is trustworthy to some individuals but not others. So the notion of a trustworthy digital identity system assumes the possibility of what I will call an absolutist conception of trustworthiness, which is to say that some trustee can be uniformly and equally trustworthy to lots of different individuals at the same time. The problem is that theoretical accounts of trustworthiness tend to reject an absolutist conception of trustworthiness, and there are good reasons for this. So the main problem is that trustworthiness seems to be something of a relativistic notion. In particular, it seems hard to imagine a state of affairs in which an individual trustee could be said to be uniformly trustworthy to absolutely everyone, to all potential or actual trusters at the same time. So take myself, for example. I'd like to think that I'm a trustworthy person. I'm trustworthy at least to some individuals, but that does not mean that I am trustworthy to absolutely everyone. And even if I wanted to be trustworthy to absolutely everyone, there are reasons to think that I cannot be equally trustworthy to absolutely everyone. So at a minimum, there are practical constraints. There are only a limited number of things that I can do at a given time. So in attending this conference, for example, I had to renege on some other commitments, and this prioritization of commitments risks a consequent erosion of trust in respect of the commitments that got postponed. So in a general sense, due to these kinds of practical constraints, it seems highly unlikely that human trustees, at least, could qualify as being trustworthy in an absolute sense, Rather, it seems to make much more sense to say that human trustees are trustworthy in a relativistic sense. They are trustworthy to some individuals some of the time, but not to all individuals all of the time. And this sort of idea is perhaps easier to think about in situations where multiple trusters are in conflict with one another. So if we think about a situation in which we've got some technological systems such as a military drone, and it's very common to talk about these systems as being trustworthy, which suggests that trustworthiness is a property of the system, it should be clear that in these kinds of conflict situations, a technology such as a drone is not trustworthy in an absolute sense. In a conflict situation, this system cannot be equally trustworthy to all of the nation states that are involved in a particular conflict. Rather, it must be the case that the system is trustworthy to one or other side. It cannot be trustworthy to both sides at the same time. So this then is the basis of what I'm calling the relativity problem. The core problem is that trustworthiness appears to be a relativistic notion. Ideally, we would like national identity systems to be uniformly trustworthy to multiple individuals and stakeholders, but it seems highly implausible to think that that this sort of absolutist conception of trustworthiness is particularly tenable. What is probably more plausible is a relativistic approach to trustworthiness. So a trustee can be trustworthy to some individuals some of the time, but not all but no trustee can be trustworthy to all trusters all of the time. So in considering the trustworthy states of identity systems, we confront a number of problems. And this is especially so when it comes to our theoretical understanding of the foundational notion of trustworthiness. And these problems are what I've glossed as the unification problem, the truster problem, and the relativity problem. So now I want to turn to a new approach to understanding trustworthiness that I suggest resolves all of these problems. And this is what I call the free energy account of trustworthiness. So the origins of this account can be traced to recent research in cognitive neuroscience and to a lesser extent research in deep machine learning. And the kind of foundational idea here is that there is this emerging consensus in neuroscience that the biological brain operates as something akin to a prediction machine. So the idea is that the biological brain is constantly trying to minimize the error associated with predicted sensory inputs and actual sensory inputs. And this prediction-related error is commonly what's referred to as free energy. Now, you'll probably be relieved to know that I'm not going to be talking a lot about neuroscience, but suffice to say this, this sort of idea in cognitive neuroscience serves as the basis for our own account of trustworthiness that I'm calling the free energy account. And at the heart of this proposal is the idea that trustworthy entities are entities that are concerned with the minimization of free energy in a social context. So while the biological brain is primarily concerned with the minimization of its own free energy, the common feature of all trustworthy entities, we suggest, is that such entities, regardless of whether they are human individuals or technological systems or socio-technical systems, is that such entities are concerned with the minimization of others' free energy. And this is what we refer to as social free energy. In essence, the idea is that what it means to be a trustworthy entity is to be an entity that takes steps to avoid states of affairs in which a truster's expectations are violated. Now, there are a number of ways that by which a trustee can minimize social free energy. So firstly, the trustee can play an active role in shaping a truster's expectations. So the trustee can be open and honest about the sorts of things that they are able to do or that they will do. They can also take steps to prevent trust being placed in situations where that trust cannot be fulfilled. Suppose, for example, that you wanted me to do something for you, and you had to decide whether or not I could be trusted to do what you wanted me to do. If you then decided to place your trust in me, but I responded by saying that I could not do what you wanted me to do, then I have in effect prevented you from placing your trust in me. And you might be disappointed by the fact that I've refused to do what you wanted me to do, but it is hard to see why we would say that I have betrayed you. I haven't broken the trust that you placed in me because you weren't able to place your trust in me. I took steps to prevent you from doing that. There is a second basic way that trustees can minimize social free energy, and that is by simply doing what the truster expects them to do whenever a truster trusts the trustee to do something. So if you trust me to do something, then you must at a minimum expect me to do what you trust me to do. Otherwise you wouldn't have trusted me to do what you want me to do. And if I am trustworthy, I will respond to this by doing what you expect me to do. And by doing that, I will have minimized the chances of your expectations being violated. So that, in outline form, is the flavor of what I'm calling a free energy account of trustworthiness. And the account comes with a number of virtues. So the first is that it provides opportunities for theoretical integration. In particular, the different ways of minimizing social free energy establishes a sensible point of contact with the accounts of trustworthiness that we briefly saw earlier. So the point about open and honest communication echoes the features of the Confucian account of trustworthiness, which is an account developed by Chinese philosophers. The point about preventing the placement of trust echoes the features of what is called the commitment account. And the point about fulfilling truster expectations echoes the features of the counting on account, the trust responsiveness account, and the encapsulated interest account. And the upshot, I suggest, is that the free energy account provides us with a means of resolving the unification problem. In particular, it provides us with the basis for a unified account of trustworthiness that doesn't so much negate these earlier accounts of trustworthiness as it does subsume those existing accounts under a common theoretical umbrella. So a second virtue relates to the truster problem, the problem about theoretical accounts being oriented to the realm of human trustees. In respect to this problem, it's important to note that there's nothing about this free energy account that is specific to human trustees. That's not to say that any old thing can qualify as being trustworthy. In order to take steps to minimize social free energy, an entity needs to have a certain degree of cognitive and communicative competence, and those competencies may be the sorts of things that only certain kinds of entities can possess. But having said all that, there is nothing specifically human about this sort of account. So we have at least a prima facie reason to see the free energy account as providing a solution to the truster problem. What about the relativity problem? So the thing that is important to note here is that the account allows for the mutual negotiation of trustworthiness. This is something that's a little hard to tease apart in summary form, but the basic idea is that trustworthiness is tied to expectations, and expectations are the sorts of things that can be cultivated and created in a collaborative fashion. And of particular importance is this idea of avoiding the possibility of betrayal. So if a trustee takes steps to ensure that betrayal cannot occur, then it's hard to see why their trustworthiness would be impugned. When it comes to the relativity problem, then what I want to suggest is the following, that if a trustee always fulfills the trust that is placed in them, they take steps to avoid misplaced trust, and they prevent the placement of trust when such trust cannot be fulfilled, then they will qualify as being trustworthy in an absolute sense. And this yields a potential solution to the relativity problem. So in response to the question of whether we can have an absolutist conception of trustworthiness, one that's applicable to national identity systems, I suggest that the answer is yes. Yes, we can. And obviously this account is a general account. It's one that's intended to apply to multiple kinds of trustees, whether the trustee is a human individual, a commercial organization, a national government, or a national identity system. But the question is what this approach means when it comes to the development and deployment of national identity systems. And there are a number of things to say here. So the first is that issues of transparency, education, and communication look to be highly important. The reason this is important is because we want to ensure that an individual's expectations about a system are aligned with what the system will do or with what it can do. And as I mentioned earlier, this is consistent with the Confucian account of trustworthiness. A second point relates to the technical features and policy frameworks that are designed to minimize the possibility of expectation violation. So a particular interest here is the idea of policy-aware or purpose-aware data access mechanisms that restrict access to information in a manner that is compatible with policy-related principles. And then finally, this idea of expectations being the sorts of things that can be mutually negotiated or jointly created. I think this helps to direct attention to the importance of individualized forms of control, consent, and authorization. And one example of this relates to the capacity of individual users being able to exert control over the operation of an identity system, such as restricting access to identity-related information to particular parties or particular situations. So I believe I'm nearly out of time. So just a brief recap of where we are. I started off by looking at the question of what it might mean for a national identity system to qualify as trustworthy. And this led to a number of problems, including the unification, the truster, and the relativity problems. In response to these problems, I outlined a new account of trustworthiness, which was dubbed the free energy account. And this account, as I briefly suggested, is rooted in research pertaining to both the biological brain and, to a lesser extent, research into deep machine learning systems. And then I highlighted some of the virtues of this account. So the free energy account provides us with a new way of thinking about trustworthiness. It provides us with an opportunity to resolve long-standing theoretical problems. But the account is largely neutral as regards the nature of the trustee. It's one that's applicable to both human individuals and, I think, to national identity systems. And it's also an account that provides us with a way of addressing this tension between an absolutist conception of trustworthiness and a relativistic conception of trustworthiness. So in contrast to earlier and existing accounts of trustworthiness, I suggest that it is possible to have an absolutist conception of trustworthiness. And this is, I think, the sort of conception that best supports research into national identity systems. And then finally, I very briefly highlighted some of the ways in which this new way of thinking about trustworthiness might shape or inform the approach that we adopt with respect to the development, deployment, and management of national identity systems. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thanks very much. We're kind of nearly out of time for Q&A, I'm afraid. We have about 30 seconds. So I'm going to summarize a list of questions that several people have put, and I don't know if we can really answer them, but there are people who kind of distinguish between the trust between the parties as a sort of static definition and the actual actions taken as a result of, trustworthy identity or not. That's kind of one line of questions. But the other line of questions is actually speaks to your very, very interesting model. As an ex-physicist, I can say it's a very cool model. But I think people are heading towards, well, if you had a decentralized national ID system, people could choose the trustees to minimize the entropy of the system or whatever you want to term your social free energy for that set of people involved in a particular activity or a particular instance. So you don't have to have one global absolutist model. You have multiple trustees, and then you choose which one you choose to trust based on the subset of people involved that need to gain trust between each other for some reason.
Yes, that is an interesting idea. I have to confess, it's not one that I thought about, but it is a very interesting idea. It's certainly one that's worth thinking about, I think.
Okay, great. So there's a lot of other interesting chat, but I think we're out of time now. But thanks very much for a very clear presentation, and it's really useful to have a kind of foundational thinking in this area. The sort of precision is nice.